Welcome to Inside the Spec. We are the podcast that bridges the gap between building product manufacturers and the architects who specify them. Each episode brings you unfiltered insights into how architects find, evaluate, and specify building materials. I'm your co-host, Megan Kacvinsky, and CEO of Point to Point. We're an advertising agency focused in securing the architect's spec through results-focused marketing. And I'm joined by my co-host, Vardhan Mehta, a second-gen architect and founder of AceLab. AceLab is an AI-driven product selection platform that brings architects and manufacturers together early in the design process.
Whether you're a manufacturer looking to better serve the architectural community or a supplier seeking to understand the evolving needs of design professionals, Inside the Spec delivers actionable intelligence straight from the source. Inside the Spec, because understanding how architects think is the first step to becoming the architect standard.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining today and welcome to Inside the Spec. I'm your host, Megan Kacvinsky. I'm CEO of Point to Point, and I'm joined by my co-host, Vardhan Mehta, CEO of AceLab. This is our very first episode, so we're super excited to be launching the podcast, and we're very lucky to have our first guest, Andre Baros. Andre is Senior Director of Materials and Research at AceLab. And he's here today to talk to us about breaking the spec cycle, trying to help us figure out why your amazing new product can't break into your specs, getting deep into the psychology of specification inertia, and talk about habit loops, managing risk, and how do you create a specification-worthy innovation that actually makes it all the way from spec to install. So first, I want to do a little bit of introduction of Andre, because he's got a pretty impressive background here. So Andre is an architect, a Chicagoan, and a storyteller, but he does live in Denver. He started his career at Harry Weiss Architects, moved to Wheeler Kearns Architects, and has also worked at HOK, SA&R, and he has taught studio at the University of Colorado, Denver. He joined AceLab sometime last year. And, I'm excited because I feel like this is going to give all of us a great peek or lens into what the conversations at AceLab are like when Vardhan and Andre are talking, and sort of give us a little bit of a behind the curtain peek at, what they're doing over there. So, Andre, first question first. Why did you become an architect?
Oh gosh. So you're going way back to the beginning. It's funny that a lot of people often said I was going to be an architect. My mom found this essay from when I was 4 and all my Legos and sort of the cliche stuff. But honestly, it was a teacher in high school. I had a high school art teacher who said I drew like an architect. I should be an architect. Her husband was an architect, and she said I drew just like him. And based on her recommendation, I applied to IIT, got in, and loved it from day one.
That's awesome. I was more of a Lincoln Logs girl myself than Legos when I was little. And my family teases me all the time now that I'm in this industry. They're like, you probably should have been an architect. You were always building things. And Legos, I think, are like therapy now. I'm so glad my son is into them because it's just very satisfying, that clicking.
It is. Yeah.
So as we get into our topic, I want you to start by being honest, right? And we should always be honest, but
Sure.
What is a time that a manufacturer actually was able to convince you to ditch your go-to specification? Tell me more about how did they pull that off? What did they do? How did they get to you?
So there's actually a really common thread through a lot of the times that I've switched specifications. And it comes down to really good reps who knew the technical details. That's probably going to be a theme in everything I talk about because most of my material decisions have come down to specific recommendations from reps who I trusted, where you build a relationship over the years. So in one case, it was for a tower. We were thinking about stucco. Stucco is not usually a product going up on a tower. We were investigating options, and my rep came back to me and said, hey, there's a prefab route here that I think is going to meet your needs better. It's less tested, but I think it's a better fit. And because I trusted him, I could be convinced. And then subsequently, because he armed me with the data, I could convince the owner, which is the other half of every one of these equations, right? At the end of the day, I have to be sold, and then I've got to sell it upstream to the owner and the builder to make sure everybody's on board.
Mhm. Just to riff off of that, I mean, I find it very interesting, again, as a fellow architect, that we always think about products and the materials we select as being so technical, and there's so many pieces that as an architect you have to learn about. You have to be able to communicate to the other stakeholders. But what really drives, the decision making to a big degree, I find it interesting. It's actually like the trust, the reliability, the relationships of the reps that we work with.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you more about the rep relationship part of it, because was that an unusual experience that you had a rep that is that good? Like, what would you say in your
No.
experience
Like reps,
working with manufacturers? How often do you encounter a rep that is that persuasive?
No, actually, I think the reps in my career have been super influential, and there's been a series of them everywhere I've worked, where you learn who you can trust and who you can go to, and they are an integral part of your team. It depends firm to firm and market to market exactly what role. Like back in Chicago, Elaine Sluga was our lighting rep. Elaine Kilberg now. We followed her everywhere, right? Whatever she recommended, we were following, because she was so good at knowing our business case, our projects, and the right fit, that any question we had, she would come in, she'd understand the problem, and she'd go out and find the right product for us time and time again. And she's one really good example, but I've had dozens of reps like that, where, you develop the relationship, you develop the trust, you get to know each other. Here in Denver, my Baselight rep was like my go-to for anything to do with masonry and paving. And if he didn't carry it, right, he actually tracked down competitors' products for me sometimes, because that was the right fit. So that's a great way to build trust, to say, hey, I don't have what you need, but here's who does.
Wow.
Yeah. And again, so I trusted him. Whatever I needed, he's who I went to.
That's awesome. And it sounded like maybe was the first one a manufacturer's rep, where they had a lot of different product options versus only one brand that they were representing? Or did you follow Elaine from brand to, like, if she went from one place to another, you're more rep loyal than brand loyal at that point?
Yes. So with Elaine, yes, she was actually working at several different lighting distributors, and we followed her from distributor to distributor. And actually a lot of her line card followed as well, right? Even the manufacturers followed her. With Baselight, it's a specific example of someone from a manufacturer who was really good. And, they offer a great portfolio, so it was easy to go to them. But even when they didn't, they were great. Going back to my time at HOK, we had a couple of great glass reps who were coming from the glass manufacturers, who were coming in to talk to us about products, talk to us about new features. I remember learning about vacuum insulated glass from one of those reps. And it was like, I can't use this today, but this is really good stuff. I'm going to keep this in my memory bank and use it down the line, when the right project comes up. So yeah, different offices have different relationships based on the projects they're doing. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great example of, like, people buy from people. They don't buy from companies. And one of the things, I mean, we see it a lot in marketing, that people, the brands leave their people sort of out of the equation in terms of the value that they deliver. How often are you also engaging deeper in the organization with, like, product experts or engineering experts, people who can help with your specification? Like, how important is that depth of team that they can surround themselves with?
Absolutely. That, going back to my stucco example from the beginning, that was a high-rise project, $80 million job. There wasn't a just recommend it and we get it in there. That was a situation where the whole technical team, from the manufacturer, the installer, the builder, everybody came together to the table, and the manufacturer was able to bring the experts to the table, the data to the table, not just the sales rep. So it started with the sales rep, but it was their ability to bring the team in that closed that deal.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. Maybe, like, since we're talking about people, if we switch to the other side, we talked about what success looks like in these relationships. Yeah. Now, on the other side, like, what are some things that as an architect now with all your experience, you feel like manufacturers are totally missing when they try to convince architects, in your experience, like the
Sure.
stories I'm sure you've heard at a bar from other architects, when they're
Yeah.
trying to convince other architects to switch specs, like what do you think they should be doing instead?
Well, maybe it's a story he's telling,
Yeah.
He's a storyteller, he said.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to say it, but follow through is a big one. There
Yeah.
was a situation where I fell in love with a product based on the manufacturer's excellent online presence, right? I was like, this is the perfect product for the project. I had trouble finding a rep, finally found the rep, got in touch with them and said, hey, I've got the owner lined up. They love it. I just need a physical sample and I need pricing, right? I just need rough pricing to get it into the project. And I could never get that follow through to get it into the project. And the builder came back with a product that I didn't like, the owner didn't like, but they could provide a path to getting it on the project. And their rep was more responsive. And so we ended up going with that product, even though none of us really liked it. So that follow through is really, really important.
Do you want to name who the rep was?
I don't remember the name of the rep. I don't remember the name of the rep. It was I can say it was Equitone who lost the job, where I really wanted to spec it and I couldn't get it in there.
If we can now maybe talk about so in that example, as an architect, you had the influence and the agency to bring in a new manufacturer, but due to any reason, it didn't really work out. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming in that case, you sort of defaulted to the firm standard, to something that the firm had already been using, or maybe it came from the owner. What do you think, like, just to address the Frankenstein in the room, like what is the true value or missed opportunity with the Franken specs, which are so commonplace in our industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there was an embarrassing situation related to that. The office I was at the time did a lot of multifamily and schools. And so we had kind of these boilerplate answers for multifamily and schools. And you'd get into these embarrassing situations where you're working on a multifamily and they're like, hey, why do you have these lockers in your spec? And it's like, oops, that got copied over from the wrong project. Or you're working on a school and, there's a high-rise feature somewhere in the spec. And you're like, why did that get copied in there? And I think that's the big risk of these boilerplate things is they're not project specific. In one case, it was a young architect who just copied and pasted the specs and details from one project to another, and the construction type had changed, right? One had been CMU bearing walls and the other had been metal stud bearing walls. And a lot of the parts were not, even though they were both schools, a lot of those specs weren't applicable. And they were too inexperienced to catch it, and that's really the danger of those boilerplates. You really want to have them, you want to check them, make sure someone's, more experienced is reviewing them. And you need the time to do that, of course. That's the gotcha.
What about another area of gotchas? Where have you tried something new and it completely backfired on you? Where have you had a gotcha moment in that regard?
It's funny. The gotcha moment in that regard was driven by lawyers more than anything else. We were working on a condo project and the lawyers were convinced that the only way that we would not get sued, and Colorado is a kind of funny condo market, was if we did a concrete structure for the building, which was completely inappropriate for the scale of the project, right? The project was 3 stories tall. It should have been wood, maybe light gauge metal framing. But again, the owner followed the attorneys, not us, and let the attorneys spec the system. And then all the baggage came with that. And a lot of things were not familiar, right? There wasn't a lot of precedent. We were having to chase everything down separately. And what was designed to reduce risk ended up increasing risk because nobody on the project was familiar with it. Familiarity is another safety factor.
Mm-hmm. That's really wild that the attorney in this case, for whatever reason, had more influence on the decision making than the architect or the owner themselves.
Yeah. And they were basing it on litigation of historic projects, but
Sure.
They were looking at it as a whole portfolio, which included a lot of high-rise construction. And they didn't make that distinction between litigation in high rise versus low rise and just projected, well, if it was good for the high rise, it was good for the low rise. And that's really not at all true. We all know that, it doesn't translate.
I think while we're on the topic of owners, it'd be interesting to hear your feedback on anytime there's a client that you're working with and you recommended something new that they haven't used or they haven't seen in the past, and they're freaking out about it. How do you handle that conversation as an architect? Like, how do you build the confidence? How do you like champion a product for something that's truly meaningful to you and you understand the value of that on the project, but they just don't really have experience with it, and that's why they're like really anxious about it?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's two key answers to that. The first key to that is showing them the alternatives and showing the product next to either yesterday's answers or similar answers or whatever. You have to put the product in context, because it's really hard for an owner to make a decision in a vacuum. If they only see one product in front of them, especially if it's a new product, they're going to be nervous, and they're not going to want to make a decision on that one product by itself, right? Do I like this or do I not like this? But if you can show them three options together, then they can say, oh, I understand now why this is the better choice. We had that in a project in Chicago where in that case, we ended up showing the owner 7 options that we had exhaustively researched. And, it was a really high profile facade. And we'd really gotten to the nitty gritty of the aesthetics and the technical performance, and showed the owner, right, here's the range and here's where I think this project needs to land. And because we put it in context, it was an easy decision for them. The other half of that is also samples. Samples are priceless, especially for new materials. If you're saying brick, the owner's probably seen brick before. But if you're talking about even, some of the new metal panel options, some of the new fiber cement options, the GFRC options that are on the market today, you have to show them a sample. And even for brick, sometimes you have to be like, no, this is not your usual brick. We've got an idea here that's different than usual. Let me show you a sample.
Mm-hmm. Actually, on that point, as a follow-up to that, so I feel like one thing that always baffles me is that as an architect, you have to know something about everything. And in the case of specifications, choosing products, just for one mid-sized project, it can sometimes mean 200 different things that'll go in. And you need to have an opinion about it, and you need to have a standard, or you need to have a recommendation back to the other stakeholders on the project. Some of those things, to your point, are really visible. They can be evaluated based on the touch and feel, but there's also all these other things which are either invisible or they're a part of the assembly. And so how do you, like, for manufacturers that make those products like insulation, membranes, sealants, adhesives, and so on, how do you, as an architect, champion those with the owner, where the answer is not as simple as the touch and feel?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because that's often the difference between a high performance building and a poor performance building. Talk about liability. It's really in those hidden details. And owners do tend to focus on what you can see and touch versus what you can't. So you have to provide data. You have to show the analytics. And what's really helpful there is a team approach. When you can come to the table and say, hey, here's the data, but also here's some data from the contractor, or here's some data from the engineer to back it up. Right? Maybe your mechanical engineer can show something to reflect that the mechanical system is smaller when you use the right insulation. Or the contractor can come back with some information of, wow, if we do only continuous insulation, your insulation installer only shows up to the job site once instead of twice, and the installation cost is half. Right. And so little data points like that about the whole ecosystem of getting those installed make a big deal. And then the other is, one of my favorite bad examples was a gorgeous project in downtown Denver where the best flashing was specified, but it was really shiny stainless steel. And everything else on the facade was dark colors, these dark muted colors. And so that really high quality flashing just jumped out. And I like taking owners to that and saying, hey, look at this, right? Even the flashing makes a difference, because your eye goes right to it. It ruined the project. Was it the
Mm-hmm.
best flashing? Yeah, it was the best flashing. And everybody knows it now.
So this is a lot of times where we see our clients get stuck with, there's a lot of back and forth, right? Like when they have new products and they're educating the architect, who is then educating the building owner. The building owner has questions that go back to the architect, that go back to the manufacturer, right? So I heard a couple things. I heard product samples. I heard the technical data. Like, what else can manufacturers better do to proactively arm you and help support you in those conversations that you're having with building owners, specifically when you're trying to get a new product into the mix?
Sure. I think, a big thing manufacturers can do is consistency and completeness of data. Like Windows, one of my favorite things to explore is Windows specifications. All the usual suspects, all the good Windows will get you a corner, no problem. If you're a new window manufacturer trying to bring a window to market, get a corner in the hands of an architect, right? Where they can touch it, feel it, see that, compare to the industry standard, which is a corner from every other manufacturer. So whatever product you're bringing to the table, you've got to know that you're providing the same, whether it's sample or data or rendering or picture, as what you're going to be compared against, right? Because if you're the new guy and everybody else has corner, and you're showing not a corner, right? Doesn't matter what it is. You already are at a disadvantage. So knowing the market you're entering is really a big deal there, and providing the same data as your competitors is a big deal, because again, it's all comparisons. Comparisons are the secret sauce to all of this.
Yeah, there's a quote. Someone famous said something similar to what I'm going to say, which is context is worth 80 IQ points. And so it sounds like what you're saying here is similar to what you. So would it help you? I mean, you said you provided alternatives to the building owner to help them understand, contextually why you were recommending, this be the chosen product. Would it be helpful? Would you want your manufacturer partners to be bringing that to you and
absolutely.
say, does that make
Yeah.
it easier if you're like, here's how we think about it and where we fit in?
Yes, no, absolutely. There was a time where I, as a young architect, had to build a foam core mock-up of a corner to be able to show the new option next to the old options. Most people don't go to that extreme of building their own sample. You must have really
wanted a new option.
Yeah. So that's interesting, though. And I mean, I feel like it's a great insight for the new entrants in a market of there's a baseline for you to meet, but let's talk about exceeding that baseline. So I know of a very famous window manufacturer that for value add, for any architect that switches specs to them on residential projects, or can prove that they were chosen by the architect on a new project, will provide free windows and doors for the architect's home. That's one extreme example of value add. But then, of course, there's other things that we know as architects that happen in the practice, where it could be a design assist, it could be let us do your shop drawings, review your details, renderings, and so on. Do you have any examples, Andre, of value add that you've seen from manufacturers, which as an architect can be very meaningful when you're entertaining new options for spec?
Yeah, actually, there's one of my favorite stories about specs was a vendor giving me back a lot of time. And what they did was point out that I had duplicate information between my drawings and my specification. And the spec took an hour to write the paragraph, and the drawings that duplicated that took a week to draw. And they came back and said, look, here's your drawings, here's your spec. You literally are saying the exact same thing in these two places. Instead of spending a week drawing these details, you're done. Like, read your own spec. Like, read what you gave me and realize that you're duplicating it. And I took that knowledge forward to every subsequent spec like that and saved myself a week of drawing every time.
So what hobbies did you take up? What are you doing with all that free time? Making or, what?
Yeah, building models of missing samples.
Yeah, doing that corner.
But that, I mean, again, I do feel like a common theme in the conversation so far has been like the role of the the trusted advisors, so to speak, the reps that can really add value, not just related to things that will help them to get specified, but then also just things that will help the architect to trust them more, just themselves as an individual. So I'm sure
Yeah.
in this case, when the rep shared this insight with you, it made you realize, oh, this rep really knows what they're talking about, as opposed to just a rep who's like trying to get into your specs.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. They helped me understand my own work better.
Yeah. Maybe so that's, I feel like, an example of really good behavior from reps and manufacturers. At the same point, I know like one common theme with architecture firms, which creates a lot of doubt, is often we're staring at a new product, or it could be a new product line from a manufacturer that we already know that claims to be X better, cheaper, higher efficiency, and so on. And so And sometimes when you just read that, or if you take that at its face value, it might seem like an improvement to your existing spec. Like, what really goes on, like, in your head at that point when you're reading a claim like that? And then
Yeah.
what is it usually as an architect, like you're trying to evaluate more, investigate more as a way to validate that claim?
Yeah. I know it's that testing and certifications aren't cheap, but I always go to the testing and certification data. And there was a product I was looking at recently, a floor product that was making some claim, and I was like, well, there's a simple standard for this. Do they meet that standard? Right? I don't need to trust their claim. I can just check the certification, and I couldn't find it. And they said, well, we have a warranty, not a certification. When I asked, like, well, the warranty is too late. If I'm making a warranty claim, it's because your product failed. I don't want to install it and then find out that there's a problem, right? The testing data tells me before I install it that it's going to work. And I mean, just like specs, certifications are another great shortcut to knowing if something's going to work or not. And as a new manufacturer, you kind of have to do that legwork to get at least some of the basic tests done to back up your claims.
So if it's a new product, no testing, no chance.
Yeah, it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
Again, unless I've got a really standing relationship with the vendor and trust them. But if there's no relationship, then I need test data to back it up.
Mm-hmm. How much has your process for how you evaluate materials evolved over the course of your career? Like, were you always that disciplined about the testing data? Is this something that you've honed over your career? Or how does what you do now evolved from what you did when you first started?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. One, it's definitely evolved over time, and it's become more sophisticated. Part of it has to do with, each market has different systems in place. That's one of the things I learned working internationally at HOK is you'll work with something that you take for granted in the US is a big deal in another market, and vice versa. In another market, like I was amazed in Turkey at the high quality stone and plumbing fixtures you could get for cheap. And so you could up your game dramatically there. But concrete was a whole other story, right? You had to it was just a mess. And it woke me up to considering new options that I may not associate with a particular market. In that case, it was retail, and I would not have thought to do a stone facade on retail. But it sort of changed my opinion. And when I was working on projects here, then I considered stone in places I didn't previously consider them. Yeah, so sometimes it's that cross pollination where you see something in one segment and you bring it to another. Like if I hadn't done transit when I was at Harry Weiss, I wouldn't have known about tensile structures. And so when I had to do a low cost parking enclosure, I already had some background in tensile structures that I could bring to the table. And, that was 10 years later, but that cross pollination was really valuable.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting from like standpoint of it's like a flavor of problem solving that is not necessarily something architects learn in school, but it's interesting to see like a project type, an architecture firm, what you learn and like what you adopt there can be this like institutional knowledge that you take into the next like chapters of your practice. And I feel like for that reason, it's also interesting maybe for manufacturers to consider. Maybe there's manufacturers that have a high market share in a certain sector, but not in others, which could be a big opportunity just from these examples or these organic ways that they're being specified into other project sectors.
Yeah. A great example of that is manufacturers who are scared of going into residential. They think the residential market is too small to worry about. But especially for new products, the residential market is way more open to experimentation and trying new things because the risks are lower, right? 4 new windows failing is not a big deal. 4,000 new windows is a big deal. And residential lets you get yourself out there. It gets great photography, right? You can get really, really good marketing shots, testimonials, experience by going after some of those smaller projects and get, sort of build up a portfolio that helps the credibility, again, especially for new products.
Right.
Get the installs. How important is seeing something like that the product has been installed and has been working for a period of time when in real life, not just in a lab in a testing environment, when selecting a new product?
I think it's a big deal. Again, even if it's just a small example, seeing something installed makes a big difference. And, I love new products, right? I'm willing to go out there and try new stuff. But there is a risk factor that I'm taking on by doing that. And so the manufacturer has to help me manage my risk because you don't get a second chance on a building.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And nobody wants to be the guinea pig. Like, you don't want to be the architect that took a product to your client for the first time and you don't have enough claim to champion the product or that manufacturer with a client if you are really convinced that it is the right fit on a project.
Yeah.
So we haven't really talked that much we talked about people, but we didn't talk about your peers or your competition, other architects, so when you're going to specify new products, how important is it that you have other architects that you can talk to that have worked with that product? Do you care what others are specifying? Do you look to see, what certain firms are using? Does that weigh in at all in your decision-making criteria? And if so, how?
For sure. I guess there's kind of 2 levels to that. There's the aspirational level where you're looking at the published work, the high profile projects, and what are they using? There's obviously a lot of credibility that comes with seeing a material used in published work at all scales, right? Like one of my favorite examples of that where I could use it was ceramic on the outside of a building. For some reason, a lot of people have a bad impression of ceramic facades. But David Baker did a project in San Francisco that got published and did ceramic on the facade. And it took advantage of the unique features of it. It was very economical, which I guess, again, people thought that it was some premium product or something like that. But seeing that work, seeing it published, and then also knowing that David Baker's office is very good about sharing, right? So they've published books and they've published articles explaining a lot of their choices, helps then someone like me in a whole different market to say, hey, look, here's a product, here's a project, here's a product, let's go for it. Versus I have this idea that no one's ever done.
Mm-hmm. So when you do that, you need to get internally in your architectural firm approval first to even bring it to the building owner, and that helps in that way also? Or do you have when do you have to get alignment within your firm, and how do manufacturers help you there? I guess we haven't really addressed that part for new products before you go out to talk to your clients about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'll go back to the beginning when I was a young architect. And so when I was at Harry Weiss, my first experience with specs and my first experience with products, there it really was really good mentors coming along and saying, hey, whoa, before you draw that, I've got this product that I would recommend for that, right? So let me show you what it is. Let me show you how it works. Let me show you why I like it before you draw it into what you're drawing. And so that mentorship, we often think about mentorship in the profession around big design ideas or leadership, and those are important too. But there's also a lot of mentorship around material choices, knowledge of products that has to get passed on through the profession. And so I think in a good office, in most offices, it's not so much the approval about materials, but it's the mentorship about materials. And, people with experience learning about things and then sharing it with the next generation, and both ways, right? The next generation coming forward and saying, hey, I found this new thing, right? I was on AceLab yesterday. I found a cool new product. Check it out. And senior leadership being open to those ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Does it vary within firms how that works in terms of the approval process or the ability to do that? Or is it pretty common that it's more of that discussion that you talked about?
I've kind of had a really lucky path through the profession. So everywhere I've worked, it has been a conversation. For example, at HOK, there was a technical committee that would meet every week, or maybe it was every 2 weeks. And anybody in a technical role was invited to join. And so, maybe it was a presentation by someone senior about a well-researched product or system or something else. But it was also an opportunity for younger folks to bring forward questions and suggestions. So a good example of that was, the one that really stuck in my head was a conversation around continuous insulation, where one of the senior people had done a bunch of research and presented, this is how we're going to do continuous insulation, and here's why. And we're only going to use mineral wool. End of story. Here's the backup for it. Here's the white papers, the case studies, the fire considerations, the sustainability considerations. And they made a compelling case. And that was, everybody kind of got it. It wasn't an unsubstantiated directive. It was an educational directive. And I'm sure that there was a rep helping them pull together all the technical information that they presented. It just saves a lot of time to be able to call somebody up and get that.
That was going to be my question. Any idea, what the rep support behind that looked like, and, what all that they provided them with? Because that sounds like a great relationship building. Get a few projects, maybe do a lot of education of a key executive stakeholder, talk to them about how do I become the firm standard, and okay, well, let's work on this together.
Yeah, so no, I mean,
that sounds from a manufacturer perspective like nirvana, right?
So. It was, and it was in the same context. My earlier example about the vacuum insulated glass came up in the same context, where rather than presenting themselves, the technical director brought in the rep to actually do the presentation to that group.
So that might be an opportunity people aren't asking about. What does your technical committee look like, right? And how can we help support you?
That's a good point. That's a good point. We talk a lot about lunch and learns, but there's often these functional meetings going on to discuss new products and standards that are an opportunity to come in and address technical questions or design questions.
So in that way, I think we've established just now that for any manufacturer trying to break into a new architecture firm, into their specs, the internal firm dynamics are the first frontier to conquer. Like, you really need to get that buy-in first internally from the architecture design firm, so that then they champion you, the owner, the contractors, other stakeholders. I feel like there's a few profiles at any architecture or design firm. There's somebody who's super experienced and senior, and they hate surprises. They don't want to deal with the submittals. They don't want any new RFIs. They want to just keep going with what's happening. They understand it. They know how to draw it, detail it, render it, and are happy with that. I feel like there's also a profile which is, the project architect who has like their first big break at the firm, or they're trying to get more notice. And they also have values which might be related to sustainability, it might be related to efficiency, and so on. And they're really trying to make their mark and bring something new, innovative to the firm. I'm sure, Andre, you'd say there's other profiles as well in your experience. But if you were to put yourself in the shoes of a manufacturer trying to break into an architecture firm, what would be your strategic angle? Like, what type of profile do you feel like, from your experience, is the most successful or most likely to entertain new manufacturers, new ideas or products?
Yeah, I think there's two reliable ways into an office. One, and maybe this is a kind of a cliche way, it's not one of the ones you listed, but the interior designers. Every firm I've worked at, the interior designers, or the people working on interiors, are the most receptive to new materials. They're the most excited about them, and they're a great way to get in the door, regardless of what product you're selling. I do think that they tend to have their awareness raised to innovation in products. And then the other is the persona you described of the young project architect or designer who's looking for their big break. And they need to figure out how to make their vision real. I remember trying to do zinc on a project for the first time. And again, having a rep from the zinc manufacturer who was really, really helpful in explaining to me how to manage the cost. He's like, you're never going to afford it the way you've drawn it here. And if you really want this material on your project, you've got to change your system to make it work. So that, that helped me make it realistic to get it into the project. And so that, again, that let me then pull that rep into the office to recommend them to other people.
So I have a question for you about the interior designer comment. So if I'm an exterior product, I'm a structural product, I'm not an interior aesthetic product. Are you saying that I still have a way in through the interior designer?
I'm not sure about structural, but for exterior, yes. Like often the interior designers are the ones scheduling the most tabletops, lunches, breakfasts, coffees, whatever. They might add you to a mix. Yeah, it's actually kind of a surprise backdoor in. But yeah, like everywhere I've been, that's been a theme that worked.
And what would you do if you're an exterior?
For example, like going to Brick and my Baselight rep, right? We were doing a lobby and the interior designer wanted to tie exterior and interior together. And you couldn't take the interior product to the outside, but you could take the outdoor product to the inside. And so presenting opportunities like that where your product can bridge the threshold. Recently, I was answering someone's question about the underside of a canopy on the lobby ceiling and what material could they use both on the outside and the inside. And again, it's the outside material usually that can come in, but it's harder for the interior materials to go out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. If it can withstand the elements, it can probably withstand air conditioning, right? So yeah.
You install it differently, right? You don't need a waterproofing barrier behind it, but on the surface, the product can just translate right to the inside.
But it's super interesting. I never really thought of it that way. It does make a lot of sense that the interior designer, maybe sometimes the interior architect, may have a closer watch on the trends, on knowing like what's innovative, knowing that it might impact what they have to design, what they have to select on a project, maybe a little bit more than the architect, who may be a little bit more focused on, like the bottom line with the code, the performance, efficiency, and so on.
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, right? The architect has to keep track of 200 things at once for every decision. Mm-hmm. The interior designers are a little bit more focused, and as a result of that, just play with materials a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great insight to pretty much wrap our session here today on materials. But before we go, Andre, I do want to ask you, what is your favorite building that you've been able to personally visit?
Sure. Gosh, there's so many. Mm-hmm. Every time you visit a project, it changes you as an architect. But one that I think I'd love to go back to was Jean Nouvel's Institut du Monde in Paris. And it's a building that has a oculus facade for regulating daylight in. And I was just in love with it. I was in Paris and wandered into the building to see it, which was really cool and exciting. I thought it was a museum, so I thought it was okay. Didn't realize that it was a private office until security found me taking pictures of the facade and asked me to leave.
That's awesome.
But beautiful building. Yeah.
Good. I love the story that you got bounced, from your favorite building.
For like the most innocent reason. Like you're just there, like just not knowing what's going on in this building. But yeah. That's really funny.
For the love of architecture, right?
For the love of architecture.
Yeah. That's a wrap on our first episode, so thanks everyone for tuning in. There's several more. Take a listen. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.